Roll up, have we got an exciting conclusion to a long marathon for you. The ultimate in printer configuration comparisons between the top 3 operating systems. Now this video I hope will make it a bit more entertaining or less sleep inspiring than the other 3 videos, because this is the summary, it's the business end. If you want to look at the details of anything I talk about here on this video, feel free to go back and look at the exhaustive videos. But this one is going to be fairly short and to the point, and the result is we have a result. Unlike other comparisons you see about various things, we end up with a they do a long-winded comparison, At the end of the day, there's one slightly in front, one slightly behind, but it's all a matter of opinion and what you like, Well, this comparison is very different. We have a solid result, and a very, very clear result. Like we have one that's got all the answers, and we have one that's got virtually nothing but trouble. So we've got a big difference between the systems. We have on one end of the scale we have Microsoft, which has the full weight of manufacturer's support, and we have on the other end of the scale the open source world's effort, and that is Linux with CUPS and Samba, and we have Apple somewhere between the two. And the results on the charts, I've weighted them according to what I perceive as important. How can I say? Obviously a printer you plug in and it just works is worth 10 times what a printer is set up where you have to tell the system exactly where to look and how to talk to it, and then install a driver to then make it all happen, and you've got to arduously work your way through it. And so I've weighted the scores in favour of, if something just plugs in and is fully functional, it has a potential score of 10 marks for detection and 10 marks for having the native driver ready to go. If the detection is partial in the fact that you have to point it to where to look, I've given it 5 points, which is basically half of what 10 is, right? And then I've given it 2 points if you point it in the right direction and it eventually sort of says, yes, I can see it there, as opposed to having to be forced completely blindly to the identification of it, or perhaps the manufacturer's driver has to go and find it, which I've had installations of these printers all the way through that scale. Okay, the next bunch of categories I've got is if the driver is in the operating system as part of the bundle, it gets it, gets the 10 points. If the operating system manages even the proprietary drivers, so it's a smooth sort of install, which is what I found the Mac did quite well, I've given it 5 points. But you required, the operating system had to be online. You couldn't just, install the system and expect it to work with something. And if I had to go the long-winded way of downloading and installing from a manufacturer's website or off a CD or whatever, I gave it 1 point. So it can be connected, but I did all the work. So you have that range there. So there's the potential 20 points. 10 for the detection ease, 10 for actually how easy the drivers are available. Okay, as a server, I have 3 categories where the server system would provide a service without having to install a driver or anything on the client. There's 10 points available. If the client requires a driver, but the server can act as a repository for that driver, and it's a semi-automated system, I've given the server setup 5 points. If you require a separate driver to be installed on the client machine, if I'd have included iOS as a client, then the difference is even greater between the systems. With say Linux, you can just walk in the room, hop on your network, and you can use all the printers, and you don't need to install anything on your iPhone or your iPad or whatever. It just works. So, but I haven't actually put that in the charts, so you can see there's quite a big, there's a lot of potential there. The other thing that I didn't even put in this chart is the Linux arrangement has a web interface, so you can administer it via a web browser anywhere on the network. So if you can connect to the machine and the machine has been set up so it'll allow remote administration, you could administer it through any old web browser. You don't need any special software on the client. So it's a very, very comprehensive system. The Windows installation was basically painful all the way through. Pretty much the easiest printer to set up on Windows was equivalent to the hardest printer to set up on Linux. I have, since this lot of filming, I bought a printer. Basically it's a Xerox multifunction machine, and it has both scanning and printing capacity. Now I can't get the scanning to work in Linux, so Linux's only strike point is some of the newer hardware. If the manufacturer doesn't provide a driver, it's problematic to get going. But on the flip side, it tends to support older hardware a lot better than the other two. So yeah, the quantity of hardware supported I didn't even bother rating, because depends how you look at it. You'll see something towards whatever bias you like. I've got older hardware which is far better supported under Linux than the commercial systems. Cross all that off. But anyhow, I think the printers that I use, the range that I've got, is a pretty good spread, and I think the table I've got is fairly well biased. But even if we just had everything's worth sort of 1 point, and you tick boxes, you'd probably end up with a very, very similar set of numbers anyway. Certainly a clear leader and certainly a clear, follower. Yeah, one thing I did find, the Mac really came to life as soon as you got online. You see it in the video if you want to go through trawling through that video. But both the commercial systems were pretty much useless as an island, disconnected from the outside world. The Mac OS. It detected about half the printers, well, the USB printers detected their presence. It needed to be poked and prodded a little bit to detect the rest. So that's reflected by the fact that the scores are 5, 2 and 2, and all the drivers had to be either using the online repository from Apple's management, which actually runs pretty smoothly. I quite like that. And there was a handful that needed, well, what is it, 3 that needed the long-winded download from the manufacturer. Both the Apple and Microsoft had failures, significant failures. I could not get the label writer to work because I couldn't pick a page size that I was happy with. There was something wrong with that. I didn't bother fixing it. I left it at its unfixed state. And the Windows had a significant failure. I couldn't delete printers. So as a result, basically I looked around all the threads. All I was left with is I had to delete and reinstall. So the Microsoft was basically a major failure. That particular failure I didn't have with either the Mac or the Linux. I actually don't think I had any failures with the Linux. That's not to say you can't have a failure, but certainly in this lot I had very little trouble with. In fact, Linux was the only thing that sort of detected everything, and I had about 2/3 the drivers ready to go. Anyhow, so the Mac OS had a 140 for the client scoring chart. It got 72, and as a server it got out of 30 got 12. The net result is around about 50% of the potential score on my charts here. Windows. Out of 140, it scored 61 as a client, and that's about 43%. As a server, funny enough, it did quite poorly. As a server, because it did not allow driverless clients, it really missed out on a lot of scores. So it only got 23% for that. The average of all possible features, it's basically 2 averages, basically 2 percentages added up and averaged, becomes 33.45%. Now Linux, out of the 140, scored 121, and that was basically because I did have to resort to manufacturer drivers for 3, much the same as I did with the Mac. But funny enough, the label writer, basically the label writer had partial support with its own default drivers. And to make it all go, it was basically from its own online repository. I didn't have to go to the manufacturer repository, which is kind of nice. So it did quite a lot better as a client, because basically it was far less fussing around with drivers. And I had the SX4500 plugged in, it worked. Fully featured, everything, both printer and scanner worked perfectly off the bat. No installation required. Alright, so as a server, to Mac, it doesn't require a client driver. Until Linux, it's just, that talks seamlessly, just the printers materialise in the client machines and they're good to go. All the settings, all the page sizes, defaults, etc. just work. So it's completely flawless that way. To Windows, you have to set up the repository of drivers on the server, which is exactly what you'd have to do on a Windows server. So it scored 5 to Windows. But you could argue that 5 is actually a result of the way that Windows' print system works. So whether you blame Linux for it or you blame Windows for it, the net result is that was one that Windows as a client couldn't connect. So I still gave it a half score, the 5 out of 10. Interestingly enough, about 10 years ago, I did in fact set up Samba as a print server, driverless, for a Windows environment, because the Windows driver available for that printer wasn't very good. And it is possible to set up so you have a driverless or near driverless installation on Windows, but you need to be a guru to set it up so the Samba becomes like a service to the Windows and then talks to CUPS as a client and sends it through the Linux print system. But it's a two-stage process and you need to be a bit of a guru to set it up. But you can actually do it. So you just use a very generic PostScript driver on your Windows client and it all just works. It doesn't give feedback for page sizes and things like that. So it can be done, but I haven't given it credit for that because there's a lot of effort to make that happen. Okay, so those 3 charts really make a solid answer. The Linux average, I'd come up with just shy of 85% on this score, but that doesn't include the added features of iOS as a driverless client, and it doesn't include the web interface. So if you included those, you know, there'd be even more difference between the systems. So I have no trouble defending these numbers, and you know, it's not open to whether I like the colour green or blue. It's just the service is there or it's not. Even if you change the way it was graded, you'd still end up with such a feature set. Linux is about double what the other two have, but Apple's is nice and clean and simple. So there you have it. That's, well, that marathon over for me. It's taken me about 5 weeks to do this, so it's been quite an exhaustive process. I hope that's of interest to you. I hope it's actually useful to you if you're trying to make a decision. I had expected the Microsoft to be in front of where it is by now, but basically what I found in Windows 10, it does not seem to have improved since Windows 95, really. The installation procedure is pretty much the same. And that's pretty bad because that's 20 years ago. Whereas the print system on Linux in that time frame has gone from something I would say was inferior to Windows 95 to just way up in front. Yeah, and Apple's kind of nice for the lay user. It's quite nice. And the network setting, I've got to say, between the two commercial systems, Apple was so easy to set up. You just set it, go apply, whatever, and it's there and available and fully functional. You do a full, ping test or ifconfig or whatever, and it all just works. On Windows, it was problematic. You had to fiddle and mess around with sort of enabling and disabling. Then it came back to life and reported that it was working, kind of, and it wasn't, and yeah, that sort of guff. So both the network handling and the printer feature handling, yeah, Microsoft was way behind the other two. Apple was at least nice to use, even though the feature set was smaller. And funny enough, that Bonjour application that you download from Apple to install on Windows as a client really made a smooth detection process of Apple printers. It didn't supply any drivers or any driverless connections. It just made the connection easy. But that application is actually a quick download and a quick install, and it just works smoothly. I've got to say the Apple application was quite good. I kind of think that Windows developers ought to go through the process of maybe converting across to CUPS. It's open source, they could all work together and make it all better and better and better. And the manufacturers could then get on board and just focus on one print system. This is one thing I think the world should get together on, because CUPS is already out there in front. It's open source, there's nothing stopping the two commercial systems using it. And funny, Apple is actually the home of CUPS these days. It didn't used to be, but now they're looking after that. Okay, well I think that's it. I hope that's of interest to you. Feel free to share, like, subscribe to the channel if you like. I do have the donation link enabled there. Obviously, any support would be appreciated. It's quite an expensive and slow process to make these videos. It costs me a lot of time. I'm enjoying the process, but it is costly. If you have any ideas for a video that you'd like me to do, feel free to make a suggestion. Or if you've got any suggestions for how I could have done this a little bit better or whatever, feel free to make a comment, ask a question, whatever. Yeah, well that's it. Bye for now.